What's it like to spy in on the spies? Kate Atkinson will be here to discuss her latest World War II novel, Transcription. How has imprisonment turned into a billion-dollar industry, and what are the consequences for the incarcerated? Shane Bauer will be here to discuss his book, American Prison. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. I'm thrilled to have in the studio here with me the brilliant novelist Kate Atkinson, author of 9 novels, is it now?
10 or 11 even? Don't know.
11 novels, approximately 11 novels, including the great Jackson Brodie series and her latest novel, Transcription. Kate, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So tell us about Transcription.
It's set in 2 time frames, 1940, 1950, and centers around a girl called Juliet Armstrong, who in 1940 is 18, and she's smart, but she's naive. She's very arch. She's a clever girl who's slightly out of water. She's just been bereaved, so that has a big cast on her character. We meet her again in 1950 when she's 28, and she's a producer at the BBC, and she's a different person, still smart, but now she is very cynical, I think, and she's been through the war, and she's been through several experiences that occur in the book, obviously, that have shaped how she is now. So in 1940, she's recruited reluctantly by MI5. She doesn't want to join because she knows that it will be clerical and it will be boring. And she gives one of those interviews, you know, when you don't want a job, so you give a very bad interview. So she lies throughout because she is a pathological liar. But in fact, it counts against her because she's being interviewed by MI5, so a liar is a good thing. So she is recruited and she does do an incredibly tedious job. And then she is moved on to do something slightly more exciting.
This is your 3rd novel in a row that's kind of taken place in this same sort of London World War II Blitz era period. The first Life After Life, then A God in Ruins. Why? What was the attraction? I know you, in your earlier novels, pre-Jackson Brodie, you also had some.
I did have some more. For me, this is not a war novel. It's just I was so intrigued by the real story that the plot is loosely based on, that it had to be of necessity set during the war because it's about MI5 in the days of the war, but it's the phony war. So it's a very different, I don't know if you know that phrase in America, but it's June 1940 when nothing appears to have happened. So the British haven't been bombed. They haven't bombed anywhere. France hasn't fallen. Dunkirk hasn't happened. So it's a time of much more paranoia and tension and people not sure what will happen. So in fact, the British government thought there was going to be a massive gas attack, which is why you see everyone carrying their gas masks around. And I actually forgot to give anyone a gas mask in this book. To me, it wasn't about rationing and, all of that Blitz spirit. It was about this particular story, but it has to happen in the war. So I'm very casual about the war, actually. I don't really go into any great detail. It's
always sort of burbling in the background.
It's just in the background in many ways, yeah.
But so if it's not a war novel, what to you is it? Is it a spy novel?
It's just a novel to me. I'm the person who has to refuse genre categorization. So I think, to me, when I'm writing a novel, it's a novel. And then it's everyone else's job to say, oh, she's written a spy novel or she's written this or that. Apparently, Life After Life is science fiction, partly a science fiction novel, which surprised me. Yeah.
Having read the novel, I didn't realize that it's true that when I read Life After Life, I thought it was such an original conceit, just the whole structure of it with the lead character who is sort of constantly reborn, occasionally taking with her bits of knowledge from the previous life, occasionally maybe not necessarily, and then dies in a variety of circumstances, sort of making her way further along in her life. I thought it was so original. So I asked my husband, who has read a lot more science fiction than I have you heard of this before? Has this been done before? Because he's fond of sort of saying, oh, no, that was done way back in the 1940s and everything. But he hadn't. So
that's
apparently it was a very original science fiction story.
I've not read any science fiction, I don't think. So I wasn't being unconsciously influenced. To me, it was just... To me, time travel isn't science fiction. It's just what a lot of writers do because they can, and you can't do it in real life. We're on, for want of a better word, a journey, and it only ends one place, and that's not a good place. But, in the novel, you can experiment with how things would be in a different dimension, I think. It's more like quantum physics than science fiction. Not that I understand a word of quantum physics.
You mentioned earlier that this novel, Transcription, takes place in 2 time periods, but it does begin a bit later on.
Oh, yes. I always forget that there's a third time period,
yes.
which is 1981, which bookends the whole book. But it's not, it's not experimenting with time or messing about with time. As people are always saying to me, you mess about with time. And I mess about with time. But this is, it's just very structural. There are 2 time periods, three time periods. And, there's nothing fancy about that.
Well, to go back to Life After Life just for a moment and that question of time, where did you get that idea of having this character constantly
Actually, for
reborn?
years, I had wanted to write a novel or even a story called Parallel Lives, in which someone, it's a bit like Woolf's Orlando, but this woman is born as a woman, the next time she's born as a man, and then she's born as a tree, and then she's born as a table, whatever. But that struck me as really not working very well. But I've been waiting to write a war novel. I've been waiting to be ready as a writer to write a war novel. And somehow the two clicked that, this would be about the Blitz, but it would also be about being reborn again and again. But as Ursula, not as a table or a tree or whatever. So it just kind of, I remember being at lunch with my publishers and they said, so can you give us an idea about the next book? They're always very, tiptoey about it. Can you give us an idea? And I said, well, there's this girl and she's born and she dies 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 infinitum. And then she kills Hitler. And they just looked at me and I could see them thinking, we can't sell this.
Not to try to categorize your novel yet again, because it's not a World War II novel. It's not necessarily just historical fiction, but it is in certain ways a kind of spy story.
Yeah, it is. And I knew right from the beginning I was dealing with espionage because I was dealing with MI5 files with the basis for the book, but I still didn't really think of it as an espionage novel because I've read a couple of le Carrés, but I haven't read spy novels, so I wasn't working within those parameters, but I knew what they would be like. So I knew that there was lots of fun things to be had, the dead letter drops and, all of the mysterious communications. But I wasn't really consciously, again, writing a spy novel. I sometimes think I'm not really aware of what kind of book I'm writing until I finish. Sometimes I get to the end and I think, oh, that's why I had that title. Or yes, now I am here at the place I thought I might get to. But there's a lot of very unconscious creativity goes on.
Well, the idea of spy novels, the idea of Juliet as a liar, pathological liar, as you described her, the idea of shifting identities for women at World War II all kind of feel very related, that this is a person, Juliet, who's in the process of kind of figuring out who she is and moving in and out of various identities, both literally when she becomes an actual spy for a period and then in other ways as well. Was that one of the attractions of writing about a spy?
Well, I think I always say that all novels are about identity one way or another. And so in this case, you're trying to, rather than find her identity, I think she's trying to mask her identity. But then she's also surrounded by an entire cast of characters who are doing the same. And I wanted to write about ambiguity. And that's a difficult thing to write about, but also that means shifting identity as well. And I wanted to feel myself as well as the reader that when I got to the end, I didn't know who anybody was and I didn't know what side anybody was on.
Well, there's a great line that you have give to one of your characters in the novel that a good spy is someone where you never know.
You know whose side they're on, yes. And I think that was quite a driving sentence because I wrote that quite early on and I thought it's important for me too to be in the fog, because the fog is a metaphor that's used a lot, because that way I'm not thinking, aha, so I'm going to make you do this and you do that and that's all going to be revealed, because I wanted to get to the end and feel that nothing had been revealed, that you think everything's been revealed and then you realise nothing's been revealed, which can be very frustrating for a reader, of course.
But then it is revealed. But I definitely do not want to do any plot spoilers here with this novel, which is very twisty. But what I thought was perhaps the most interesting thing is that there is a reveal at the end, and yet it's very much open to the reader, up to the reader, to then think about, well, how did that work in the novel as I went along unsuspecting? And
also the morality of it, because there's a certain morality involved in that, in what everyone turns out to be. And it's, I think everyone in the book is just following their own path.
Were you also inspired to kind of shed light and give a backstory and a central story to many of the characters who are often overlooked in what have become kind of familiar stories, the spy novel, the World War II novel, and yet here rather than focus on the kind of head spy, the Godfrey Toby character, we are focused on the transcriptionist behind the scenes. And rather than focus on all of the men, we're focusing on the women. And another character who's often used or has been used in the past as a kind of source of an easy villain or a source for humor, which is a gay character, which you weave in here for a period novel in what feels like a very fresh way.
Well, being homosexual in 1940 in Britain is absolutely not something you're going to reveal. But of course, it makes you a good spy because you're very good at keeping secrets. And Juliet herself is completely baffled by his attitude to her because she's 18 and she's an English girl who's been at an English girls' school and who has never come across this concept at all. So that's extreme naivety. And yet it's quite touching, their relationship, I think. In the end, they have an understanding. And in 1950, we see a little bit more of how you can start to reveal perhaps your true nature, but you're still on the wrong side of the law. So it is about... The novel, in a way, is about truth because it's whether, you're going to be true to yourself or whether you have to maintain a different kind of truth in order to exist.
I'm going to ask you a question, both because I'm curious about the answer, but also because I want to ask you about a specific review of this novel. Do you read reviews of your own books?
I end up reading reviews, no matter how horrified I am by the concept, I always end up reading them. And even someone will thrust a review and say, this is a great review, and you read it. And then there's a but in the middle. And I'm sure every writer's the same. It's only the but that you remember.
Right, the caveat.
Yeah, everything else is just meaningless.
Well, I won't focus on the to be sure paragraph of this review, but there was a review this week in The New Yorker that I thought made some interesting points. I'm not sure if you've read it.
Yes, I have, and I'm puzzled by that review, and there's many points in that review, and I wanted to say, hang on.
Well, here's your opportunity.
Well,
say it.
It calls me some kind of matron of English literature, which I found quite insulting. I think matron is such a dubious word to apply to a woman. I don't know if it has a different concept but as if I'm even the midwife giving, shelter to these supposedly more avant-garde writers. I think I'm a very avant-garde writer, and I think I disguise it very well. And I think it's very curious that he sees me as an English traditionalist, because I'm not an English traditionalist, and I'm wondering how he's come to that conclusion. I've got lots of things to say about this review, but I leave it to you because you want to quote something.
Well, I know. I mean, it also raised questions for me. The review was by Jonathan D., and I thought it was I should make clear, a very favorable review.
Yes, yes, indeed. I'm just focusing on the but.
Exactly. So that's your job. I'll focus on the good points. I'm not sure that I necessarily see the comparison. He, contrasts you with Rachel Cusk, another contemporary.
It's a very strange contrast to make. But I think he sees us at two ends of the spectrum.
See, and I don't see that at all because I agree with your point that I think that you're very experimental in your work. I mean, I thought Life After Life.
He also says I don't write beautiful sentences, which I think is
write beautiful
wrong.
Sentences. I want you to read beautiful sentences later, but I'm going to actually read because I marked up the copy with this is not a beautiful sentence, but I love your descriptions, which I find so clever and apt and original. And this was describing a character in a cafe, and you wrote, like many in Moretti's, he had the shabby air of the post-war European diaspora. There was a trollish look to him, too, as if he had been put together from leftovers. He could have been sent from booking to play one of the dispossessed. And it goes on. It just keeps getting better. So on that point, I disagree. That's not a beautiful sentence, but it's a great one, or a great few sentences. Jonathan D. in this review in The New Yorker, when he was comparing you with Rachel Cusk, he was saying that you still believe in plot, which I'm glad for. Uh-huh. And I'm curious if you start from plot, or if you start from character, or if there's how important plot is to you when you're writing.
I start from structure, and structure is different from plot. I think structure is the bones, that plot is the flesh too, as it were, because if I have structure, then it's so much easier to move around in the book. But plot, yes. Plot and character, which are strangely old-fashioned, seen as strangely old-fashioned, non-avant-garde things, which is I'm curious about because, okay, there are writers writing who are not fixated on plot and character, but then that's true of 100 years ago when, Gertrude Stein wasn't obsessed with plot and character. So, that argument about experimentalism always annoys me slightly because the novel in itself is experimental. But I love plot and character. And I know that every reader loves plot and character too. And there is nothing wrong with plot. And I'm curious that he sees that as a, that. And I also think Rachel has plot. She's not plotless in her novels. I think it's just a way of seeing more than anything.
For our listeners, would you read a passage from Transcription?
I'd be delighted to. This is a scene that takes place quite early on in Juliet's career as a spy, when she's still a humble typist, and Peregrine Gibbons is her boss, and she does have a thing for Perry, it has to be said. So when he suggests that they have an outing, she's thinking that this is going to be a seduction, which it isn't, but... They drove to the Hambledon Valley, where they swapped the comforting warmth of the car's interior for a chilly riverbank. It's still only April, for heaven's sake, she thought, but Perry seemed insensible to weather, although his layers of tweed must be keeping him warmer than her own ensemble, a rather light coat, thin sweater and her best skirt, not to mention her good pair of stockings and smart shoes, for she had been expecting to be viewing the landscape from the windows of the car, not to find herself standing in the middle of it. Countryside was more of a concept for Juliet than a reality. "Otters," he whispered, spreading a tarpaulin sheet on the riverbank. "Sir?" Had he said otters? Not a seduction, then. Time rolled by, very slowly, very damply, very coldly. Juliet wondered if waiting for the otters was perhaps part of her training in some way, surveillance perhaps. And patience. She did need training in patience, she knew that. And it did feel strangely like an undercover mission as they sat breathlessly still on the riverbank, waiting for a little family of otters to show themselves. He glanced at her when the first one appeared and flashed her a delighted smile. He really did have a nice smile. His whole face changed and he became a man who looked capable of happiness, which was not the impression he normally gave. The otters, she realised, were an offering to her in some way. "Neither fish nor flesh," she murmured, and then felt embarrassed because she recalled there was something bawdy about Falstaff's description of an otter, although she wasn't quite sure what. The quotation, vulgar or otherwise, was wasted on Perry, who said, "Well, certainly not a fish. The European otter, Lutra lutra, is from the family Mustelidae, which includes badgers and weasels." "Oh, of course," she said. Juliet had never seen otters before, and the kits, and she knew that was the term for them because he told her, were charming, sleek and playful. But really they were just otters, and if he was going to give her anything, she would rather it was the picnic that she'd expected him to bring.
It's a scene in which the two characters are essentially doing nothing but lying the entire time.
She also betrays her obsession with food, I realise.
There's a great line in there, too, that countryside was more of a concept than a reality.
Yeah, she's a town girl. He's a naturalist.
Well, she's a town girl, but she's also incredibly naive and ignorant at this point, at least in terms of sex.
Completely. She has no idea what it entails, which is part of the reason she doesn't understand Perry's, true nature. But she's read her mother's romantic novels, and that's about the limit of it. So for her, it's this very misty, veiled act that will take place one day, and she's hoping it's going to take place with Perry.
What about that passage? Why did you choose to read that passage?
Oh, just because I think it does introduce her a little bit, the fact that she does just automatically give a different answer to the reality. And also she's masking her ignorance as well, of course, and he is completely oblivious to it all the time. So they're constantly not communicating with each other for the whole of the novel until the very end, when finally they do communicate in a very touching way, I think.
Yeah, I thought one of the sweetest kind of passages in the novel. You recently mentioned on this book tour, I think on the UK leg, that your next book will be another Jackson Brodie novel.
This is true. I've finished it. I've never been on tour with a book when I've finished the next one. It's a very odd feeling. I keep thinking, did I really finish it? Have I really written that book?
Do you get confused about which book you're talking about?
Oh, yes, because my thoughts aren't even with the Jackson book I've just finished. They're with the next book I'll be writing. So it is very confusing. And then people talk about books a couple of books ago, and I can't remember characters' names or anything. So yeah, your head is always full of the book you're writing.
So the next book is the Jackson Brodie coming out in 2019.
Yes, this time next year.
Well, now that you said that there's another book after that, can I ask what that one's about?
No, that's a secret.
All right, next time we get you in our studio. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, no, thank you so much for asking me.
Kate Atkinson's new novel is called Transcription. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Shane Bauer joins us now from Portland, Oregon. His new book is called American Prison, A Reporter's Undercover Journey into the Business of Punishment. Shane, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
How did you get interested in this subject?
I had been living actually in the Middle East working as a journalist. I was living in Damascus in 2009, and along with a couple of friends, I took a trip to Iraqi Kurdistan and was detained near the Iran-Iraq border and ended up spending 2 years in Iranian prison. When I got out of prison, I came back to the U.S. I came back to California where I live. There had been a massive hunger strike at the time where estimates of around 30,000 prisoners were demanding an end to long-term solitary confinement.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been in solitary myself. I had also been in hunger strikes, so I was kind of naturally drawn to this. And when I was ready to get back into my work, rather than going back to the Middle East, which is what I thought I would do, I kind of jumped into this issue of solitary confinement and did an investigation on that, found that we have thousands of people in solitary for over 10 years in this country. And I just kind of got pulled into the U.S. prison system from there. And after kind of working for a few years on prisons and coming up against the barriers that reporters constantly come up against when reporting on prisons, I had the idea to apply for a job. And I specifically wanted to do this with a private prison because since these prisons have existed, specifically the Corrections Corporation of America prisons have existed since the 80s, we haven't really had a kind of really up-close look at the day-to-day life inside of these places.
Mm-hmm. What are the barriers of reporting on prison for those non-journalist listeners?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is it hard?
It's very difficult to get access to prisons. Access has actually gotten more difficult over time in recent decades. Typically, if you get inside of a prison, you are kind of given a scripted half-hour tour. In a lot of states, you can't request specific inmates to interview. If you want to interview an inmate, it is provided the prison chooses who you interview. And even getting kind of basic data about prisons is difficult. We have public records laws that allow us to access this information, but oftentimes states just do not comply, and you have to sue them to get them to comply. With private prisons, it's even more difficult because oftentimes these public records laws don't apply because they're private companies, so they're not subject to the same transparency requirements.
Just to give people a sense of the scope of the privatization of prisons, what percentage, do we even know this, of prisons in this country are currently private operations?
About 8% of the total prison population, which is over 2 million people, are held in private prisons, so about 130,000 people, and 2/3 of the immigrant detention population. The industry is about a $4 billion industry. The company that I investigated at the Corrections Corporation of America is a $1.8 billion company.
And are these private prisons concentrated in any particular region of the country?
They exist throughout the country, although they are more concentrated in the South.
And that's where you went. You went to Louisiana. How did you decide which prison to infiltrate?
Well, I filled out an application on the website of CCA, and I filled it out truthfully. I didn't lie. I included my current employer, and honestly, I didn't really think that it was going to work, but I just thought, it's going to take an hour of my time.
Who was your current employer?
Mother Jones.
So you are upfront about the fact that you're a journalist and you apply online. What happens then?
I, within a couple of weeks, get phone calls from several CCA prisons asking me if I'd like to do a job interview. And I do some interviews, and they do not ask me why I want to work in a prison. They don't ask about my job history. They just ask me the kind of generic questions you might expect from doing an interview at a Walmart, like how do you work with others? How do you deal with a boss that tells you to do something you don't want to do? And it was almost as if they were trying to convince me to take the job. The HR person that I spoke to in Louisiana asked me if I liked to fish, because there was great fishing in the area. She was, trying to convince me to move across the country for a $9 an hour job as a prison guard.
So you get an offer.
Yeah, I'm accepted. I end up having a couple of prisons to choose from, and I decide to go to Louisiana. I work in Wynn Correctional Center, which is a medium security prison of about 1,500 inmates. Happens to be the oldest medium security private prison in the country, founded in the early 90s. And the town that it's in, Winfield, is a town of 5,000 people. The average household income is $25,000 a year. And before I started there, the last sheriff was locked up for selling meth.
Okay. You get there. It's your first day. Describe what that was like, your first impressions of the prison and what it was like for the people who work there.
Well, I went through a month of training to start with. So my first day going to the prison, I was obviously very nervous. I, was worried that my cover would be blown. I didn't know what would happen if they discovered that I was a journalist. I met the other cadets in the class. Some of them were just fresh out of high school. One had his only other job he'd worked was at a Starbucks. There were single moms who were there because they needed health insurance for their kids. And the training, I remember my second day of training, we're told that part of our responsibility is to, as corrections officers, is to deliver value to our shareholders. And we went through this lesson about where the instructor asks us what we do if we see two inmates stabbing each other. And, somebody says, we call somebody, and others says, well, maybe we should break it up. And he says, our job is to just shout at them, stop fighting. And that's it. He says, we should not get in between them. We are not going to pay you that much. The next raise you get is not going to be much more than the one you get next time. And he says, if those fools want to cut each other, then happy cutting. And this is kind of a theme that repeated throughout training, this idea that we also need to kind of protect the company's liability. If we get in the middle of two inmates fighting, we could get hurt, which is going to cost the company money.
That's bad for business.
Yeah.
What does that phrase mean, delivering value to your shareholders in the context of a prison?
Well, the way that the company makes money is the state pays them a per diem. So every day they would get $34 per inmate. And the contract that it had with the state of Louisiana required that the state keep the prison 96% full at minimum. The company's also, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and in different states, the contracts vary slightly. In some states, it makes $80 per inmate per day. And one of the ways that it makes money aside from this is, and remains competitive compared to public prisons, is through staffing. It pays guards and other staff less than a public prison would, and it keeps very low staffing levels. There were days that I came to work in this prison of 1,500 inmates where there would be 24 or 25 guards.
You had been a prisoner, as you mentioned earlier, before you went. I'm assuming you felt some sense of identification with the inmates, but over time, did you find that your sort of allegiances became closer to that of the guards, the other guards?
Yeah, I did actually. When I went in, the idea of taking this job was not so much to write a story about what it's like to be a guard, but to show what life is like inside of a private prison. And I kind of thought naively that I would, just kind of be an easygoing guard, stay out of people's way, and, I wouldn't have much trouble. But the pressures of that job are so intense. I mean, I'm in a unit with 350 prisoners, and on the floor there's one other guard, me and one other man who's in his 60s. And we're literally not able to do all the things that we're meant to do in a day. And I am the kind of, in a way, of the face of the company to the prisoners. I'm the person they're interacting with day to day. Prisoners are constantly frustrated that their recreation time is getting cut, their classes are canceled. There's always issues of there not being enough staff to run the programs that they're meant to have. So there's so much tension. There's also a lot of violence between the prisoners. There's stabbings. I see stabbings in front of me. And I find myself becoming more and more authoritarian. And, in the beginning, I did think of myself as a former prisoner, which is what I am. And so, yeah, there was some kind of natural sympathy, even though, I had been in a political prison in Iran, and these people were in prison for different reasons. There's still kind of a sympathy for just the experience of being locked up. And it was challenging at first to do things that in some ways felt like a betrayal to my former self. One time I found a cell phone, which is contraband, and had to confiscate it. When I was a prisoner, I would have taken a cell phone at any moment, and I would have never kind of snitched on another prisoner that had a phone. But my job was, of course, to take the phone. And really quickly, I would say within the first couple of weeks, I had to, I kind of turned off that part of myself. Any part of myself that would feel guilt for being in the role that I was in, I just had to turn it off. And once I did that, the job became much easier. And I think this is common. I saw this with other guards too. Either when they started on the job, they would either do the same thing and kind of become more hardened, or they would quit because they just couldn't do it.
You lasted for 4 months on the job. What happened? How did this end?
I was in the prison during a very chaotic time. There was kind of a meltdown while I was there. There was almost a riot. The company had sent in its tactical teams to bring the prison under control. The state had taken over. And in the midst of this, my colleague at Mother Jones, James West, came to Louisiana to shoot some video. We produced some short videos to run with the article that then later led to the book. And we kind of shot footage around town. He interviewed me, and then I went home to go to sleep and to get ready for the next day. And he went to the prison after dark to get some nighttime shots from the outside of the prison. He was spotted by a guard and was then arrested by deputies and spent the night in jail. And officers, there was state police there, and they had said, "We don't care that guy works in the prison. We just want to know what you're doing there." And, so it seemed that they somehow figured out what had happened, that I was working there. I found out later that they had searched his footage, his camera, and his laptop without a warrant. So they saw the interview of me. So as soon as he got out of jail, we just packed up and left the state immediately. And then it kind of became known. It was leaked in the local media the next day that I was a reporter working there. So the company knew in advance, and they had sent letters to Mother Jones threatening to sue us if we published the article. And
you did publish the article. It was a long article to great acclaim. What made you decide that this needed to be expanded into a book? What could you get into here at book length that you couldn't in that piece?
There were a lot of things from the prison that I didn't, even though the article is very long, I did not space to get into some of the characters in the prison and kind of the more subtle aspects of the life in the prison. But I also felt that to really tell this story of private prisons, I needed to go back in history. So I essentially spent a year doing historical research, digging into archives, news archives, finding old penitentiary reports, reading, old books, memoirs. And I discovered a lot that I did not know about when I was working in the prison. And I wrote the book in a way that kind of alternates chapters between my undercover experience and the history of for-profit prisons in America from before the American Revolution up to the present. And I kind of trace the evolution of these prisons. For most of American history, especially in the South, prisons were intended to turn a profit at some periods directly for states and for some periods for private companies. We've had periods in American history where, especially after the Civil War, where the entire Southern prison system was privatized. And the system that was known as convict leasing was actually more deadly than slavery. Death rates throughout the South were 16 to 25% a year. Prisoners were forced to labor and sort of fulfill the role that slaves had filled before the Civil War.
Is this a uniquely American enterprise, or have prisons been privatized in other countries?
There are private prisons in other countries. The UK has them, South Africa has them, Mexico does, and other Latin American countries. It was an American invention, both the modern kind of corporate version and historically. Penitentiaries themselves were invented in the United States, and the very first penitentiary that ever existed was meant to turn a profit. So it is a very deeply American creation.
Is there anything favorable to be said about a private prison versus a public prison?
The only argument for them is that they save money. There's nothing about the way that these prisons function that is better. On almost every indicator worse. They're more violent. There are less programs. And this is not just my observation as one prison. There are also Department of Justice studies that support this. But even the issue of cost is controversial. The Department of Justice recently had a study saying that the cost savings are negligible. And the issue of cost is actually a very difficult one to get at, to really kind of find out how much states are saving. Counties will offer subsidies to these companies to attract them, to their counties, which of course goes back on the taxpayer. Some states will, like California, the companies worked into the contract that the states cannot send them inmates with severe medical issues, which means that those prisoners are in public prisons, which goes back onto the taxpayer. So there's a lot of kind of hidden costs. But, ultimately, the question we have to ask ourselves is, even if there is some level of cost savings, is it reasonable for us to put people in prison under a company whose first priority is making money rather than any form of rehabilitation?
One final question. You mentioned when we began talking that you spent time in a prison in Iran. How did your experience in an Iranian prison compare with what you saw in a private prison in America? Obviously, you were on a different side of the equation.
Yeah. It's really hard to compare prisons or say that one is better or one's worse. But the prison I was in Iran, Evin prison, I was in the political ward. So I was held with activists, pro-democracy activists. We were kept in solitary confinement or in a cell with other people, but we could not interact with anyone outside. When we left our cell, we were blindfolded. I was almost entirely cut off from the outside world for 2 years. People were physically tortured there. In Wynn, obviously it was not a political prison, but where Evin was controlled in a very extreme way, Wynn was the opposite. It was chaotic. It was very minimal structure. So it was very violent. There was not violence between prisoners where I was in Iran, but in Louisiana, there was a lot. So it was kind of the oppressive nature of being in a hyper-controlled place versus the all-out chaos and violence of a private prison.
Shane, thank you so much for being here. This is such an important book. It's called American Prison, A Reporter's Undercover Journey into the Business of Punishment by Shane Bauer, and it's reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, Maria Russo, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, Maria, because it's been a while since we've had you on here. Maria is by day our children's books editor, but also a reader of many grown-up books, too. What are you reading?
I try to keep a grown-up book or two going at the same time as I'm reading all the children's books. Right now, it's The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, Dennis Johnson's last collection of stories. As you know, he died last year. And I'm just catching up to it. And it's breathtaking, devastating, and it's just the thing right now.
Have you read a lot of Johnson?
I haven't read all of it. I mean, there's a lot, and I do prefer his short stories. The thing I like about these stories is they really are, to my mind, going toward the novella length, which is the perfect length. They're not too short. They're not the commitment of a novel. And they're just like Jesus' Son. They give you this sort of soulful feeling of looking at the whole spectrum of human life and human society, but coming from a place of how can we find connection? How can we look for something greater amid all of the disaster and dysfunction? There's also beauty and hope and beautiful language. And it's really helping in these difficult days to have a little Dennis Johnson in your mix.
Dennis Johnson as therapy.
What's
your therapy this week, John?
I just finished a very small and I thought really interesting book that I would highly recommend, although it's probably hard to get here. It's called Robinson. It's by a writer named Jack Robinson, and that's actually a pen name for a British publisher named Charles Boyle, and he runs this small publishing company that publishes this book and others. It's a book that falls into the category, I would think, of there's something sort of Jeff Dyer-ish about it. It doesn't have that kind of humor and panache, but it's a little more serious than that. But it's like a book about writing a book. It's about having read Robinson Crusoe as a British school child and about how Robinson Crusoe there, since he's so widely read in school when people are young, is this kind of foundational myth of almost this Ayn Rand, self-dependent, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's very much a post-Brexit book. And he only says that explicitly a couple of times, but it's really about Crusoe's fear of strangers, his need to build a wall on the island, even though he's essentially alone. It's really fascinating. And the other thing that he does, which I love when books do this, is that he writes about all of these other stories, and I didn't know there were quite so many, that are directly influenced by and are riffs on the Robinson Crusoe story. And one of the many that he mentions is a novel called Foe, F-O-E, by J.M. Coetzee. And I hadn't read Coetzee in a while, so I picked up this also kind of slender novel, and it's about a woman who washes ashore, shipwrecked, meets Robinson Crusoe and Friday, and then she's recounting the story of what happened on the island and how she came to know them.
I actually read that in college in the class in which I was assigned to read Robinson Crusoe.
Oh,
it was
so
the sort of origins of the novel. It was interesting to read them side by side.
Oh, we should talk off air.
Yes.
You're the first person I've met who's read Foe.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Greg, what do you have in front of you other than, you do have Ulysses?
I did bring Ulysses with me because it's been a while since I've talked about it, except to mention in passing that I'm still reading it. And I've been dipping in and reading a sentence at a time or a paragraph at a time. I finally finished the Cyclops episode of Ulysses and moved on to the Nausicaa episode, which is very different. Nausicaa is a very famous episode of Ulysses. It's the episode set on Sandy Mount Beach where Bloom masturbates while he's watching a girl and her friends hanging out. And she's aware that he's watching and she's kind of acting very flirtatious. When Ulysses was serialized 100 years ago, this was the chapter, the episode that that scandalized
alerted the
readers.
censors.
Yes, exactly. And got him into so much trouble finding a publisher for the book as a book.
I mean, how clear is it that he is masturbating? How is it written?
It's pretty clear. I mean, to the extent that anything in Joyce is clear. And it's funny because in the earlier section, the Cyclops section, he's in a bar where there's this Irish nationalist going on. And a woman in the door points out that his fly is undone. And so it's Bloom is such a kind of seething mass of sexual insecurity and just lust kind of always on display that the open zipper ties right into that. But it also foreshadows this masturbation scene. There he is, next time we see him again with his zipper open. Once you're in Joyce's world, there's always kind of sex going on, and it's clear that is...
The censors weren't crazy.
Yeah.
They weren't hallucinating it.
But you've got another book there.
Yeah, I'm also at the same time reading Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers, which Michael Cunningham reviewed on the cover of the book review earlier this year. It's a novel that takes place in two time frames. It toggles back and forth between the mid-1980s at kind of the dawn of the AIDS crisis in a community of gay men in Chicago, focusing especially on one of them, Yael Tishman, who's kind of the protagonist of those sections, and then jumps to basically the present moment, 2015, with a friend of his, a woman named Fiona, whose brother died of AIDS back in the 80s. And she is now going to Paris in search of her daughter. And it tells those stories simultaneously. One of the things I'm really enjoying about this book, Yael Tishman works at an art gallery in Chicago, at an art gallery at Northwestern. And there's this strand of the book where the gallery is just getting off the ground. They're trying to build a permanent collection. And they've had an offer of sketches from very famous early 20th century artists, Modigliani among them. But all these sketches were acquired directly from the artists by a woman who modeled for them. And there's no kind of paperwork behind them, no authentication.
Provenance.
And no provenance, exactly. And so Yael, who's this young gallery worker, not even really in charge of acquisitions, but she has sought him out, this woman, to needs to authenticate them. So there's all this sort of like people talk about Philip Roth, American Pastoral. You learn all about glove making, and it's this, the whole idea of process carrying through a novel is fascinating.
Talking about art, the most incredible scene in Largesse of the Sea Maiden, the title story, is that scene where a wealthy art collector takes one. He has a Marston Hartley drawing, and someone sort of dares him. And he says, "I could throw this into the fire if I want. I own it." Do you remember that scene? And then he does. Yeah. And it's just this incredible take on waste and wealth and the value that we give to art and where does it...
Right, how you assign value to art.
And if he owns it, he says, I own it, it's my right to throw it in the fire.
Yeah,
but then don't we all own art?
It's one of the great questions about forgeries, too. You're looking at exactly the same painting and, depending whether this person painted it or somebody, else just imitating it, it's worth hugely different amounts.
Pamela, what does your reading this week have to say about art?
Nothing. Well, actually a little bit about art on the surface, perhaps not, but I was recently in Athens for a conference on democracy, and one of the authors there whom I interviewed and then moderated a panel with him was Rob Ryman, who came out with a slender book earlier this year called To Fight Against This Age on Fascism and Humanism. It came out in January and was reviewed in the book review at that time. And it's an interesting little book. It's two separate pieces. The first is an essay, and the second is actually a work of fiction, although a very persuasive work of fiction, realistic in certain ways and kind of metaphorical, obviously metaphorical in others. So the first one is called The Return of Fascism, and Ryman's argument basically is exactly that. It's back. But what's interesting about this essay is that he wrote it in 2010 in the Netherlands, which is where he's from and lives, and in response not to certain presidents of the United States, but instead to Geert Wilders, I think is his, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I'm probably pronouncing it in some weird, vague, unapplicable Middle European way. But anyway, he's the head of a kind of fascistic far-right party in the Netherlands. And so this essay was written largely in response to him, but it certainly applies to other figures both in Europe, whether it's Orban in Hungary, and then, people might also see an analogy here in the U.S. What is, I think, the best thing about Ryman is that he's just one of these classic European intellectuals who will bring in not only philosophers and political thinkers, but also literature into his arguments. And the second piece does that even more explicitly. He writes a lot about Thomas Mann in both pieces, and about the fact that, really interesting anecdote about Mann, that when Thomas Mann came to America in 1938, he did this national tour, and thousands of people would show up at these venues. And he said that when fascism comes to America, this is 1938, it will come in the name of freedom. That was very interesting. And I was reading this actually at the same time that I was reading Bob Woodward's Fear. So I was thinking, freedom, fear, just thinking about those two ideas and about fascism. But the second piece is called The Return of Europa, and it is fiction, he also wrote it before 2016, but just translated and published in America first in this book. And it's about literally Europa returning to a modern Europe, and she tries to check into a hotel because she, of course, doesn't have anywhere to live. She doesn't have papers. That is a problem, not too much of a problem as long as she can pay for her room. Of course, she doesn't have money. They ask where she's from. She is from Phoenicia, which is in Lebanon. So now she is a refugee. And it sort of starts off with that question of what happens when a stateless, moneyless person who is Europe returns to Europe of today, and how would that person be greeted? And then it sort of shifts from there to two different. That first scene is in one of the famous hotels in Davos. So we already see that we're talking about the Magic Mountain. And then we go to another hotel in Germany. He uses a fake name for this hotel in the short story, but you can actually, with the help of Dr. Google, figure out what this castle is. And it does have a real history behind it. But at that second hotel in this story, there is a kind of international conference of ideas, and you have three different people coming, and the first person is sort of arguing that technology will save us, and the second person makes a different argument. And the arguments are so persuasive that you kind of forget that you're in fiction. So it's an interesting little book. It takes, a couple of hours to read. And so that's what I recently read.
It sounds timely in ways that are distressing.
It was. I have to say, it was very interesting to read it in the context of Athens and these times, shall we say?
Well, I'm impressed by people who can dive into things that are even more reflective of the times. I think I'm escaping a lot with Robinson Crusoe.
You're reading a Brexit novel, John.
Yeah, that's true. I guess metaphorically it's apt.
All right. Well, I'll escape next week. We'll follow Maria's lead and go elsewhere. Greg, Maria, John, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.